Hi all, welcome to part 2 of this webinar series. In this webinar series, we are going to cover advantages of net metering. I am Shiva, Director Strategy for Chaos Renewables. If you have any queries regarding this video or any of our previous videos, please leave a comment and we will try and answer those queries by responding to those comments. So typically in our homes we have an energy meter which records the power which we consume. So the energy meter records whatever power which we consume in terms of number of units of energy consumed, and that is what we are charged at the end of the month by the utility. So it's same for all utilities across India, and in our case we also will find something known as a fixed charge in addition to the number of units which you consume. So for these two components you are charged in your electricity bill. So normal metering, the power flows only in one direction, and for that power you are charged. In bidirectional metering, the meter has the ability to record the power flow in both directions. Like we spoke in our previous videos, solar is not a constant source of power, so it requires grid to complement it, or some other source. Since we are talking about grid tied solar power plants, that's where net metering comes in. The grid will also act as a bank and accept excess power production from solar power plants. So the net meter kinds of facilitates this process. So let us try and understand by looking at an example. So in a typical solar power plant, the solar panels convert the electricity to DC and an inverter converts it to AC power. And whenever the grid power is whenever the solar power is not sufficient to power the load at your homes, the grid power will complement it, and that power will be recorded as an import in your energy meter. And whenever there is an excess solar power, especially during peak, during the noon time, that's when the solar production hits the maximum. The excess solar power will be sent back to the grid, and that will be recorded as an export. So that's the basic functioning. Now let's look at a few examples to understand this concept better. For example, let's assume that your solar power plant is producing 60 watt of power and you have a 100 watt light running at your home. So the solar power is not sufficient to power this load. So during that time your load will draw additional 40 watt power from the grid, and that power will be recorded as an import in the bidirectional or net meter, and that time there won't be an export of power to the grid. Let's take a scenario that let's assume that we reached noon when the solar power peaks and we have around 120 watt of solar from the panels, but the load is still 100 watt. So during that time the excess 20 watts of power is exported back to the grid, and that will be recorded as export. So typically the unit of energy is not watt, the unit of energy is kilowatt hour, or it's also called units. So it is whatever is the watt peak capacity into number of hours, that's what is called as a kilowatt hour or watt hour. So 1 kilowatt, if it runs for 1 hour, it's called 1 unit. So when we look at our electricity bill, this is the electricity bill of one of our customers in Kerala. So different utilities have different format, but essentially in all electricity bills you will find something known as an import and an export. So this is a monthly utility bill which comes to the end customer. If you see that for this customer, the import is 478 unit and the export is 352 units. So the customer has to pay for the difference between 478 and 352. That is the net consumption. So they will be paying the bill only for the difference. So that is the concept of net metering. And just to understand the bill a bit better, if you look at it, we have something known as fixed charges. So this is a residential customer, so it's typically constant based on the amount of power you consume, amount of energy you consume. But for other customers, it's typically based on the kilowatt of sanctioned load at that facility. For example, industrial or commercial, that would be the case. And you also have a component called duty on top of the energy charges, which is again on a per unit basis. So energy charges is what we can save when we go for solar. I hope everybody has got some sufficient time to look at this bill and understand it. We'll move on to the next slide. So this is a particular case only, and this slide is applicable only for customers in Kerala. So in KSEB actually gives a provision where customers can pump excess power to another property and use it there. So let's take an example of this customer. So this customer is an import of 99 unit and export of 1061 units. So it's the export is very high. So what happens for this customer is that he has another property where he's pumping this 1000 units and he's using it there. So he has more roof space in this property than the other property has less roof space. That's the reason he has gone for solar in this property. So that's a good scheme. So let's say if this is 1000, then he can use actually 950 units in the other property at what, and he can have the same net metering provision in the other property's bill. So that's a very interesting policy element introduced by the KSEB net metering scheme in Kerala. And net metering is now not available in certain states for certain consumers. So earlier almost all states had net metering. Now I believe only Kerala and I mean southern states, I think Kerala and Karnataka has net metering to some extent. Tamil Nadu has gone to some other metering scheme called feed-in tariff, and Karnataka is also pondering something known as gross metering. I will cover those in another session. So here one important point which we need to understand is export is not the actual production at the site. So export is whatever we export to the grid after self-consumption. For example, if you take this picture, you can see that when there is an 120 watt solar production and there is a 100 watt load at home, only 20 watt is being exported. So the export is not equal to solar production. The 100 watt self-consumption is not recorded in the meter as an export. So many utilities have something known as a generation meter, which will record the total production. I hope everyone understood what net metering is and what is the benefit of net metering. Before we conclude, I mean, there is another important point which I would like to cover, which is what happens if you have excess power at the end of a month. Let's say this particular person, his other property is not using 950 units, it's using only 800. What happens to the 150 excess units which he produced in this month? So that gets carried on to the next month if it's KSEB, and KSEB has a yearly settlement, which is a very nice thing where you can produce in 1 month and then use it in the next month, and that settlement period is September-October period. So if you produce some excess power during summer months, you can consume it during the rainy time as well. So that's an excellent feature which is there in KCB. But again, the other policies are not that attractive. BESCOM has a monthly settlement, and the excess power settlement will be at 3 rupees per unit. I hope everybody understood net metering. We will cover the benefits of solar plant and calculations in the next session of our webinar series. Thank you.